Tonight on KQED Newsroom, migrant families who enter the U.S. could be detained indefinitely under a new rule proposed by the Trump administration. And as summer ends, students are returning to school, but for some, it's also a return to feeling anxious and overwhelmed. Plus, a web series that's filmed in and about Oakland presents a timely and funny look at issues of race, immigration, and gentrification. Hello, and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Brian Watt. We begin our show with the fight over immigration. This week, the Trump administration unveiled a new regulation that would allow for the indefinite detention of migrant families crossing the border. If approved, the rule would eliminate a key part of a 1997 court settlement that limits the detention of unaccompanied minors to 20 days in federal custody. Administration officials argue the new rule is necessary to deter mass migration at the border, but it's likely to face legal challenges from immigration advocates such as the ACLU, which denounced the move as, quote, yet another cruel attack on children. Joining me now to discuss this is University of San Francisco law professor Bill Hing and KQED immigration editor Tyche Hendricks. Welcome to both of you. So, Professor Hing, the new rule, it published today. What happens next? A federal judge has to approve it. What's the process now?
That's right. So legal papers are being filed as we speak, actually challenging the new proposed regulation, and the government will respond. And Judge Dolly G, the federal judge overseeing the Flores case, will hear arguments very soon and make a decision on whether or not the regulations are consistent with the Flores settlement agreement.
And Tyche, for people who don't know, there is a key court settlement from 1997 that's in play here. It established this 20-day limit on detaining migrant children. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in the Clinton administration, there was this legal settlement that basically said children are vulnerable. They're not the same as adults. And in immigration custody, they need to be cared for with sort of child welfare standards in mind. So the settlement favors release of children as quickly as possible, keeping them in the least restrictive setting possible, and in a facility that's licensed for child care by the state. And it also gave oversight to the plaintiff's attorneys representing the kids to be able to go in and monitor and make sure that conditions were okay. So then under the Obama administration, there were a lot more families coming, and they set up these family detention centers that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was running. And Judge G said, those are not licensed for child care. That's not an appropriate place for kids. It's more of a jail-like setting. And the government said, well, we need at least 20 days probably to get these kids placed in a proper facility or get them released. And she said, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that, okay, 20 days, it would be acceptable if you're moving with, due diligence and in good faith to put them in a more appropriate situation. So that's where that 20-day thing came from.
And Professor Hing, what would the elimination of this 20-day limit lead to?
It would lead to the possibility, honestly, of indefinite detention because, as Tyche was saying, they can release, they can turn these families over, in theory, to a state licensed facility. But that was the problem that the federal government had. There are no state licensed facilities for family detention. Now, children who are alone, unaccompanied children, they do get turned over to state licensed facilities, but not families. So that's why the 20 days constricted the government. They actually had to release folks, and they've been releasing many of these families with ankle monitors, for example. But now the government is proposing that they want to keep them longer because they presumably need more time to take care of resettlement. But the Trump administration has admitted that really this is about deterrence. They want to send a message to migrants that you shouldn't come here because you may end up being in custody for a long time.
And I want to ask you about that in a sec, but I want to ask Tyche first. Do you think that these detention centers, as they are established now, are equipped to house families, lots of families, for a long time?
Well, there are about 3 of these facilities. The 2 biggest ones are in Texas. I think they can hold about 3,000 people altogether, 3,000 beds for parents and kids. I think if they're going to do this indefinite thing, they would need more space. And, you know, child advocates say that detaining children, even if they're with their parents, is harmful for kids. So, as Professor Hing said, detention isn't required. The Trump administration says they want to hold people while their asylum proceedings go forward, but those cases can take years, and the courts are very backlogged.
So let's get back to this issue of trying to send a message. I heard a White House spokesperson basically saying the Flores settlement incentivized immigration. A family or a family-sized group shows up at the border, knows that they will be detained for 20 days or days, and then basically released into the country to await trial. They're in, it's all good. Their journey has all been worth it. Is this what you have seen?
Absolutely not. I mean, if that were true, I wouldn't feel so bad about what's going on. But listen, at the clinic that we have at the University of San Francisco, we have over 300 cases, and half of those are family units. I went to Honduras in March and spoke with families that were thinking of leaving, and I volunteered at the border in Tijuana. And these folks are fleeing because of desperate circumstances. They're not coming to visit Disneyland. They're fleeing violence, gang, cartel, and in many cases, domestic violence. And so, in my experience, these folks are not coming just for a walk in the park.
Congress approved $4.6 billion in emergency humanitarian aid. It earmarked funds to improve conditions in immigration detention facilities, based in part on what Professor Hing, other immigration attorneys reported seeing at a facility that housed migrant kids, mothers, and babies. Tyche, along with removing the limit on detaining migrant families, what would this new rule affect the conditions at the facilities where migrant families are being held?
Well, I think one of the other big changes that would happen if the new rule goes into effect and the Flores settlement goes away, then the oversight that these plaintiffs' attorneys on behalf of the children have, and that the federal judge has to make sure that conditions are up to par and are appropriate for kids, that oversight goes away. The lawyers like Professor Hing have been able to go inside the facilities and talk to children, and that wouldn't exist anymore. And so also without the requirement that the facilities be licensed for child care by a state like the California, Health and Human Services folks, then it's the federal government doing its own licensing, and there are some concerns that there's not as much independent oversight of conditions.
Immigration, stopping it essentially, has been the banner, don't give ground issue for the Trump administration. Do you, Professor Hing, see any daylight for a compromise, a conversation that leads to President Trump, Democrats, immigrant advocates coming together and making some sort of compromise that ratchets down the rhetoric that we hear so often about immigration?
I wish I could be more hopeful. In my opinion, this is really about Trump trying to play to his base. He doesn't have to be labeling these migrants a national security risk. He actually could be doing what was happening prior to 2014. I'm saying this in part criticism of President Obama as well. It's become a pejorative term, but catch and release worked. People were arrested, they were taken into detention, but they were processed very quickly and sent along the way, because ICE knows where folks are going. They have names, addresses of relatives, and there's a very high appearance rate, so people were not absconding. And until we recognize the humanitarian nature of really why people are leaving, I don't think that there's going to be room for negotiation unless that kind of rhetoric is ratcheted down.
University of San Francisco law professor Bill Ong Hing and KQED immigration editor Tyche Hendricks. Thanks, both of you, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
By now, most students in the Bay Area are back in school after the summer break, but these days a lot of students are struggling with anxiety on top of their academics, whether it's the pressure to perform academically, online bullying, or mass shootings on campus and in public spaces. Triggers for feeling overwhelmed or anxious abound. Parents and teachers can also miss warning signs and struggle with how best to help. Joining me now is Katrina Schwartz, the co-host of KQED's Mind Shift podcast, and Janelle Scott, a professor at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So, Katrina, I can remember when in 10th grade I realized that high school is hard. I had a history class that I loved the teacher, and I wasn't doing well in it. I was struggling, so I got really anxious about it. But in your Mind Shift podcast this week, I get the sense the anxiety that you were focusing on is more multi-layered. What are kids anxious about today?
Well, I think kids are anxious about a lot of things, and it's kind of different for every kid, but you're right that we're not just talking about stress, we're talking about debilitating anxiety, a condition that gets in the way of stuff like work and school and social life. So some kids are dealing with academic pressure, but other kids are dealing with worrying about their families and what's going on in the immigration system, or violence in their neighborhoods, or disappointing their parents. So it's very different. It depends on the kid, I'd say.
In the podcast, you spend time with an El Cerrito High School student, Brianna. And I actually want to play a clip of her describing how anxiety would overtake her.
I started thinking about my mom, like she needs better and I should be doing this and I'm not doing it, and then I start to panic and then I can't breathe and then I get shaky. I end up like in a ball on the floor, just trying to get my breathing back on track.
Wow. That is very overwhelming, paralyzing. How is Brianna doing now?
I know, it's heartbreaking, isn't it, to hear that? Yeah, she's doing a lot better. And in her case, her anxiety really went along with her depression. And she was really good at hiding all of that. But one day at school, she had a panic attack in her first period. And luckily, her teacher took her to this place at their school, their wellness center. It's called the James Morehouse Project. And Brianna was able to see a counselor. And over some time, she kind of delved into some of her issues, really took care of some of her depression and also her anxiety. So she's doing a lot better. She's actually going to community college this year.
Awesome. Janelle Scott, I want to get you in. We are hearing a lot about online bullying, other expressions of hate that students, when they go to school, have to deal with and process. Is this something that academics are tracking?
Yes, certainly. I think when we think about children and adolescents in school today, we have to understand that they are living at this nexus of school, society, home, and social media. And given the climate in which we're living in our society, in which we're seeing hate speech and hate messages abound, certainly students are bringing much of that to school. And so there was a recent study out of UCLA that tracked a nationally representative sample of school principals, and in fact found that, for example, over 60% of the principals reported hearing anti-immigrant sentiments from their high school students at school. And so that's just a small sample. We hear similar things about transgender students, GLBTQ students, and just racist messages at school.
Violence is also an issue on a school campus, in public spaces, as I mentioned, and students have to be thinking about this. How are school districts handling this need for awareness, but also management of that awareness for the potential of violence?
Right. Yeah. With the rise of mass shootings and school shootings in particular, districts have engaged in active shooter drills. We've seen some of those displayed on the media around the country. But I think that the consideration is whether those drills actually raise anxiety or alleviate anxiety. And so districts, I think, are really figuring this out as they go along. They're taking a look at their school security, locking gates, having visitor check-ins, all these things aimed at keeping children safe, but I think attending to the social and emotional needs of the children at the same time as we're thinking about their physical safety is something districts are still very much working through.
And we've been hearing a lot about the presence of perhaps more police officers on campus.
Right.
I imagine that cuts both ways for some students. Am I correct?
Right. Certainly. I mean, for racially minoritized students who have come of age in an era in which we are seeing police violence targeted towards children who look like them, the presence of more police is not necessarily a comfort for those students, right? And those, because we have highly segregated schools by race and socioeconomic status, we often see those schools where minoritized students attend more likely to have metal detectors, for example, that students need to walk through, armed police, and we also see disproportionate rates of discipline and punishment for those students in those schools. And so, again, it's the sort of, intention to protect students can actually make them feel less safe at school.
Katrina, are schools, parents even, ready, adept at detecting anxiety, like unmanageable anxiety in students and their children?
I mean, I think this is a really tricky issue because anxiety can look like a lot of things. For example, it looks like procrastination, or it looks like poor time management. And so you can imagine as a parent of a high school student, you're just thinking, do your homework, like, why aren't you starting your homework? But really it might be that they can't. They are really struggling to even put the pencil to paper, and they're avoiding it because they know they're gonna have a really hard time with it. And so I think the psychologists I talked to really emphasized trying to have sort of a collaborative approach with your kid, being curious about what's going on. So rather than just jumping to the conclusion of you're lazy and you're not doing your homework, try to say, like, what's going on? Like, why are you feeling this way? And then together maybe we can come up with some solutions and some strategies to handle the anxiety. I think the same goes with teachers as well. Anxiety can look like, defiance. It can look like, just messing around in class. And so it's very hard to see these things and correctly identify it, I think.
Janelle, I know you were a teacher in the Oakland Unified School District for a while. One of the issues that I know is on the minds of students and parents and even teachers is the fact that some schools may be closing. Is this something that you think is contributing to anxiety?
Certainly in the district, this is a very hot spot. There's been a recommendation by a state sanctioned organization, FCMAT, to close up to 24 schools in the near future. The district's taking a slower approach to that, and the idea is to put more resources into fewer schools. But the process by which schools are being slated to close is fairly opaque, and it's raised a lot of anxiety for students and parents and teachers.
Katrina, you mentioned a wellness center and a program at El Cerrito High School. That offers me some hope that schools are starting to figure out what they can do about this, but what other resources are out there?
At El Cerrito High, for example, they talked about making the passing periods a little bit longer so students weren't quite so rushed between classes, or moving to a block schedule where students only have 4 classes per semester instead of 7, so it's fewer things to worry about. Just concentrate on those few. So those are some macro ways, but then in addition they're doing things like running anxiety groups to make sure that students don't feel alone, that they know that there are other people who are struggling with this, and they're getting strategies for how to manage it.
Katrina Schwartz, co-host of KQED's Mindshift podcast, and Janelle Scott, a professor at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education. Thank you very much to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And to hear more of Katrina's interview with students about their struggles with anxiety, go to kqed.org/mindshift. In the North Pole, a web series streaming on YouTube, Benny Ramirez and his 3 friends face challenges and forge creative solutions as they navigate life in North Oakland. Their journey is both humorous and poignant, pushed and pulled by timely struggles ranging from gentrification to climate change and immigration in a politically polarized America. Actor Rosario Dawson serves as an executive producer and stars in the show's upcoming 2nd season. Joining me now are the North Pole co-host, director, co-writer, and co-creator, Ivan Iturriaga, and Santiago Rosas, who plays Benny, a main character on the show. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So, Ivan, for people who are just learning about the North Pole, what is this series and what inspired it?
Well, I'd call it a dramedy. So it's a very comedic approach to very dramatic issues that are facing all of us today. And it follows 4 main characters, 3 locals from North Oakland, and how they deal with, in the first season, gentrification, jobs versus health, greenification, all these things that are affecting our community. And the metaphor of the show is really, so when I was growing up and going to high school in Oakland, in the Bay Area, that neighborhood, North Oakland, was called the North Pole. And it was in hip-hop songs everywhere, and so my peers were calling each other polar bears. And so since we address a lot of climate change also in our show, that's the main metaphor, like the locals of this neighborhood are being displaced in the same way that polar bears are being displaced in the actual North Pole. And that's what we play with a little bit.
Wow. So I will confess that I moved to North Oakland 3 years ago from another part of California. Thank you. And this was when I started working at KQED. I had no idea that it was actually called the North Pole, that people who had been there for a long time were called polar bears. I can't be called a polar bear, but I actually think this would be a good moment to show a clip of Santiago Rosas in action as Benny, since he's actually talking about polar bears in this clip.
Please, brother, say the polar bears. Excuse me, man.
To all my gluten-free, dairy-free, organically kombucha comrades, our planet's most majestic creatures are under attack. Save the polar bears, save the environment, save yourselves!
Did the donations go to support the Arctic penguins, too?
Well, actually, penguins are found in Antarctica down on the south side. We don't have them up north. But lucky for you, we got love for both the poles in this program.
That's great.
Santiago Rosas, you must be having a blast. How did you get this part and what drew you to it?
You know, well, first of all, I heard about the gig on SF Casting here. It's a local, you know, for actors. And when I heard about it, it was right up my alley because it talks a lot about social justice. It talks a lot about issues that, for me, are familiar. I studied at Arizona State University, and I got a degree in social justice. And so as an actor, whenever you work on a project that stands for something, it's a no-brainer. So for me, when I heard about what they were talking about, what the message was, I had to audition for it. And the audition process was awesome. And I just went in there, just was myself, and had a lot of fun doing it. So, yeah.
Well, Yvonne mentioned that this is a dramedy. This is comic situations that come out of very, very serious issues. I wonder if you work hard to avoid caricature, because caricature, stereotypes, very, very tempting in a situation when you're trying to make comedy. Is this something as an actor you're working hard to avoid?
Well, you know what? I'm very grateful for my training. I studied acting here at the Meisner Techniques studio in San Francisco. And, you know, one of the things that they really stress is just truth. And for me, whenever I work on a role, it's not about making a caricature. It's about making a four-sided character, right? It's about being real. It's just like us. Like, if you think about it, like you're creating a human being.
Right.
And just like, you know, human beings, like, we're all complex people. Right. You know, so, you know, we laugh, we cry, you know, and for me, it was about the truth of the situation, the truth of, you know, what's really going out there in the world. So for me, like, it was just an opportunity to, you know, help guide this story and be as honest and truthful as possible.
And can I ask you, as the director and co-creator, is avoiding caricature important in conceptualizing and building the show, Yvonne?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even it's harder when you're depicting people you might disagree with, people you might think are really the target of a lot of our complaints. And so yeah, definitely I think it's about humanizing these stories. It's about also attracting folks to experience the show who might not totally agree about everything. And so I think showing complexity, both for those who you disagree with, and also like, you know, this show features folks of color. And I think a lot of times you start seeing more and more in film folks of color acting and performing, but like they're usually very one-dimensional, two-dimensional characters. And you know, we try to display that we're humans, and we can go from being really intellectual in one moment to flipping and code switching and being something goofy and playful, or more aggressive. You know, it's complicated characters, and that's what we're showing.
One of the executive producers of the North Pole is actually a nonprofit called Movement Generation. Who are they, and what do they bring to a production like this?
It's a very unique collaboration. I think very few filmmakers, I think, have ever experienced this collaboration with a nonprofit creating a fictional work. And what they bring is a belief that story matters, and that in order to change the issues, we have to have people really care about the people that are involved and affected. And so, in more practical terms, what that meant is, let's say we were talking in the second season, we're addressing wildfires for like subtext most of the second season. And so as creatives, we're like, okay, this can happen, this, whatever. We come up with storylines that then we bring to them, and they address, well, this is not that realistic. What would be more practical for us to use in actual movement building would be this. And so it's a collaboration in a creative process to make it actually, the show, have a life outside of the screen, and to actually really be useful for people in the grassroots movements.
Santiago, you are not from Oakland. Yvonne, you went to school in Oakland. Oakland seems in this show to be a character. It's not just taking place in Oakland, but is it a character in your minds that plays a part in this show?
Yeah, absolutely. I think not just in what you see, but the energy of Oakland really pushes and pulls these characters to react to the world around them. And, you know, we have an actual polar bear in the show that is, I would call, like the spirit animal of this, this neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I think in a lot of my work, Oakland definitely, with its history of social justice, you know, if something happens in the country, there's a march in Oakland, there's a gathering, and then musically and in terms of the arts, Oakland actually definitely has a flavor that we're, you know, projecting in the show.
Yvonne Iturriaga and Santiago Rosas, participants, producers, actors in the North Pole show. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Season 2 of the North Pole premieres September 10th. Until then, you can catch up on Season 1, and it's worth it, streaming now at thenorthpoleshow.com. And that'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Brian Watt. Thanks for joining us.